Voice is Donna Ah Chee. She's CEO of the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress. Donna's a Bundgalung woman from Northern Rivers, New South Wales way, but has been in the Territory for many years, and she's been CEO of Congress for quite a while. They deliver integrated comprehensive primary health care to Alice Springs and 6 remote Aboriginal communities. In her spare time, she's on the board of AMSANT, IAHA, chair of the NT Aboriginal Benefits Account Advisory Committee, Northern Territory Primary Healthcare Network.
That'll do.
Sometimes, yeah, too many committees, but we just want to thank Donna. And also, I look forward to the day when Donna is CEO of an Aboriginal controlled hospital in Alice Springs as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Nikki, for that wonderful welcome this morning. So, good morning, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. I begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Larrakia people, the traditional owners, custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, and to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge Richard for his beautiful welcome to country last night. As Greg has said, my name is Donna Ah Chee. I am a Bundgalung woman from the far north coast of New South Wales, but I've lived on beautiful Arrernte country, Central Australian country for the last 30 years. Today I'm addressing you as the CEO of the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress, the largest and oldest Aboriginal community-controlled health service in the Northern Territory. I'll say a bit more about Congress in a minute, but first I'd like to thank the Indigenous Allied Health Association for inviting me to speak today. I feel very honoured, and I'd like to congratulate IAHA on its 10 years of advocacy and action to support its members. And I'd just like to take a minute to personally acknowledge Donna Murray. I've seen her operate at a national level in meetings that I've been in, and she definitely has the, your profession at heart and doing the best that she can to make sure that she sees Indigenous allied health professional in the forefront in terms of health service delivery. So I'd just like to acknowledge Donna for that. I'd also like to acknowledge all of you, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health professionals here today, and the dedication and skills that you bring to improving the health of our communities across the country. I'd also like to acknowledge my deadly staff sitting up the back there, and including one of our cadets who is training in exercise physiology. Today I want to talk to you about 3 areas that I think we can work on together to make national progress on improving Aboriginal health. First, we need to invest in a comprehensive model of primary health care. We need national recognition that these services are the foundation for meeting the holistic needs of our diverse communities. Second, I want to talk about how I see allied health as being an important part of this comprehensive, multidisciplinary model of primary health care. Put simply, we need you lot to be part of our services, to help us deliver culturally responsive care to all who need it. Last, we need a stable national policy and political framework for dealing with Aboriginal disadvantage. We have a blueprint for this, and that is the Uluru Statement. The Uluru Statement gives Australia a path forward for addressing the deep-seated disadvantage that many of our people still suffer. In addition, the recent partnership between the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations, including the Indigenous Allied Health Association, is an historic development. Let me start with the first of these 3 points, the need to invest in comprehensive primary health care delivered through Aboriginal community-controlled health services. We must start here with a recognition that the conventional health system is failing our people. Of course, there have been some successes. Infant mortality rates, for example, have hugely improved over the last few decades. However, despite the Close the Gap initiative, and despite numerous other policies and programs by governments across Australia, the big picture remains unacceptable. I don't want to quote a lot of statistics. As Aboriginal people, we live our lives in the shadow of those numbers. But it is important to understand that the Australian government's own headline health target is not being met. In 2008, they committed to closing the gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians by 2031. A decade on, the figures show that life expectancy for our peoples is slowly increasing. However, it is increasing at a slower rate than that of non-Indigenous Australians. The life expectancy gap is therefore widening, not closing. Clearly, something is very wrong here. So what is it that needs to be done? There is no silver bullet, of course, no simple one-dimensional solution that will magically fix the continuing effects of colonisation on our health. But in my view, an important part of the answer is increased and sustained investment in multidisciplinary models of primary health care delivered through Aboriginal community-controlled health services. These Aboriginal Medical Services, AMSs, were established by Aboriginal communities from the 1970s onwards in response to the failure of mainstream services to meet our needs. Just how badly the mainstream health system was failing our peoples is sometimes forgotten, so it's worth revisiting some of the historical statistics. For example, in the mid-1960s, the mortality rate for Aboriginal infants in Central Australia was estimated at 250 per 1,000. In other words, 50 years ago, well within the lifetime of many of us in the room, a quarter of Aboriginal children died before their first birthday. Even in the mid-1970s, the rate was 60 to 70 per 1,000. Worse than all, but the most disadvantaged developing world countries today. Today, the rate has fallen to around 10 per 1,000 live births, as our health services have dramatically improved access to health care. It was to address the suffering behind these numbers that Aboriginal Medical Services were established by our communities across Australia, often initially with volunteers, but later with government funding. The AMSs embodied a new model of service delivery under the leadership of community elected boards and in keeping with the holistic conception of health derived from our diverse Aboriginal cultures. The new services promoted a comprehensive model of primary health care. Today we continue that tradition of culturally responsive care delivered through a multidisciplinary team approach in which Aboriginal health practitioners work alongside nurses, doctors and allied health professionals. Our comprehensive model of care goes beyond the treatment of individual clients and is quite different to that often offered by most mainstream services. And the evidence points to Aboriginal community-controlled health services as highly cost-effective, with a major study concluding that, and I quote, up to 50% more health gain or benefit can be achieved if health programs are delivered to the Aboriginal population via Aboriginal community-controlled health services, compared to if the same programs are delivered via mainstream primary healthcare services, unquote. Aboriginal community-controlled health services were also, and remain, a powerful statement of self-determination. In rejecting the notion that health is just about the absence of disease in individuals, they committed themselves to addressing the social, economic, political causes of ill health. Long before the term social determinants of health was recognised by policymakers, Aboriginal community-controlled health services were campaigning about the negative health effects of poverty and inequality, of lack of education, of poor housing, of alcohol and other drugs, of discrimination, racism and dispossession. Advocacy, being a voice for the communities we serve and speaking out against these underlying drivers of poor health, is in the DNA of Aboriginal Medical Services. These twin pillars of Aboriginal community-controlled health services, multidisciplinary comprehensive primary health care and advocacy, continue today. Therefore, the first area we need to address, if we are serious about tackling Aboriginal ill health, is to increase resourcing to strengthen and extend Aboriginal community-controlled comprehensive primary health care services. The second thing I want to talk about today is about how I see allied health professionals, and especially Indigenous allied health professionals, being an important part of our model of care. Our community-controlled health services prioritise allied health as an important part of our model. Each year, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare reports on services receiving Commonwealth funding to address Aboriginal health. Their data shows that Aboriginal community-controlled health services are consistently successful in providing on-site access to allied health than non-Aboriginal controlled services. For example, 61% of community-controlled services provide on-site access to an optometrist, where only 45% of non-community controlled health services do so. 41% of our services provide dental services, but only 29% of non-Aboriginal services do so. Increasingly, our services include dietitians, pharmacists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, and other allied health professionals. So there is no doubt that services such as Congress are a more effective platform for allied health services to our people. But it's not just what services we provide, it is how we provide them. The foundation here is our shared concept of Aboriginal people of the holistic nature of health. As Aboriginal Health Services, we go back to the definition of health for our people contained in the 1989 National Aboriginal Health Strategy, which defined health for us as not just the physical well-being of the individual, but the social, emotional and cultural well-being of the whole community. This is a whole of life view, and it includes the cyclical concept of life, death, life. And I know that this is also the definition that IAHA uses. So we are absolutely on the same ground here. The implications of this definition of health are profound. I think it is fair to say that the mainstream health system is still struggling to come to terms with those implications. For me, one of those implications is the need for multidisciplinary care. You can't approach the holistic health of our people with programs based on the list of body parts or diseases. We need to treat the whole person, to provide holistic wraparound care in a way that meets the full range of their health needs. In our services, that means that multidisciplinary care is central to how we operate. That is a challenge. For one thing, funding programs rarely support multidisciplinary care, but instead encourage care provided in silos. For another, as some sporting team coach once said, it's easy to get good players, getting them to play together, that's the hard part. But at Congress, for example, we are committed to the process of ensuring that all members of the care team understands and respects the competencies and contributions of all team members, are able to communicate with other members of the team, value the reflection and learning that comes from working respectively with other disciplines. Key to this is that all members of the team are employed by the same organisation, have to abide by its common policies and procedures, and use the same clinical information to support care for the client. And of course, embedded in an Aboriginal organisation, they are all subject to our strong emphasis on cultural responsiveness in everything that we do. This is where our emphasis on employing and training up our own mob is so important. In those organisations funded by the Commonwealth, specifically to deliver health services to our people, Aboriginal community-controlled health services have 57% Indigenous staff, compared to only 38% in non-Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. Particularly significant is the much greater commitment to our services to employing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in training positions and in leadership roles such as CEOs, managers or supervisors. Nationally, our sector employs almost 3,500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers, making it the largest employer of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. This employment of our own people in our own organisations, not just in frontline positions, but as decision makers and leaders, is crucial to our record of delivering culturally responsive services. It also plays an important role in encouraging our young people to get educated, to get trained up and become health professionals. This is a bottom-up way of addressing the key social determinants of health. I think Indigenous health professionals, like many of you in the room today, are incredibly important, not just for delivering culturally secure, high-quality healthcare services, but also because you can be an inspiration for our young ones. When you provide care to an Aboriginal child or young person, they are looking at you and seeing the possibility for their own future. They are probably thinking, yeah, I can become a physio or an OT or a dentist. I could be like him or her one day. But despite the successes of our sector in employing allied health professionals and Aboriginal people, we need to do more. Allied health is still a big gap for us. In 2017-18, nearly 2 out of every 5, that's 37%, of Aboriginal community-controlled health services reported that access to allied health services was one of the most important challenges their organisation faced in addressing health and wellbeing of the Aboriginal community in which they served. So we need to get more allied health professionals and especially more Indigenous allied health professionals into our services. I'd like to say here and now that we really love to work with IAHA on graduate support and training at Congress and to how we can support the development of career paths for those graduates in our organisation. So the second area we need to address to improve the health of our communities is making sure that we have the opportunities for allied health professionals, especially Indigenous allied health professionals, to work within our Aboriginal community-controlled health services. The last area I want to look at is the need to establish a stable national policy and political framework within which sustainable long-term policies and investments can be made to tackle Aboriginal health. We need to ensure consistent, evidence-based policy which includes our people's voices and experience. We have the right to be involved in making the decisions about those matters which affect us. As one of my board members says, no decisions about us without us. And yet, what we've seen over the last decade or more, a series of policies and programs coming out of Canberra with little or no genuine involvement by our communities. Frequently, we are consulted on issues that others have defined as important and decisions are made elsewhere on how to go forward. Often we are not meaningfully consulted at all. Small wonder the public policy made in this way fails. Small wonder that the Close the Gap targets are not being met. However, there are two important developments for addressing this situation. The first is the Uluru Statement from the Heart, adopted by the First Nations National Constitutional Convention in Uluru in May 2017. The Uluru Statement addresses the fundamentals of the relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians. It included demands for processes of treaty making and truth telling, and a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament to ensure ongoing structures for Aboriginal input into policy making and the life of the nation. The formal recognition that a treaty embodies would increase Aboriginal people's control over their own lives and can be expected to lead to better health and wellbeing outcomes. Treaties can also provide an enduring and effective policy foundation for the provision of health services. Treaties with First Nations in New Zealand, Canada and the United States have contributed to more effective, stable and sustainable policy and service delivery systems, and consequently to a much narrower health gap than we have here in Australia. In addition, the establishment of First Nations voice to federal Parliament would help end our marginalisation from key decision-making processes and contribute to more effective policy making and program design. Government is yet to commit to implementing the Uluru Statement, and this is something we all need to keep pushing for. However, in the meantime, we have been successful in getting a voice in the government's Close the Gap process. In March this year, the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, and the Coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations signed an agreement to work together on closing the gap. The Coalition of Peaks includes NACCHO, AMSANT, and other representatives of the community-controlled health sector, as well, of course, the Indigenous Allied Health Association. This is an historic agreement. It means that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives will share decision-making with governments on closing the gap. It will allow a much more integrated approach to health. It will be able to consider all the social determinants of health, including housing, education and employment, and most importantly, the poverty and the inequality which underlies so many challenges that our families and our communities face. The agreement also establishes a joint council on closing the gap. This is the first ever COAG council that includes members from outside government, with representatives from the Coalition of Peaks sitting alongside ministers from every Australian government. So I'd like to congratulate the IAHA for being part of this historic process. It is an important way forward in ensuring we, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, have a collective voice in making decisions about our health. So to conclude, I want that click. There we go. So to conclude, I've outlined 3 areas where we are working together to support a genuine approach to addressing the continuing poor health and well-being suffered by our peoples. First, support for Aboriginal community-controlled health services. Second, support for allied health as a key part of the comprehensive multidisciplinary model of care that Aboriginal community-controlled health services represent, and especially Indigenous allied health professionals. And third, support for our right to make decisions on those matters that affect us through the Uluru Statement and the recent COAG agreement with the Coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies. These are critical pathways to improving the health and wellbeing of Australia's First Nations, the original sovereign owners of this country. Thank you.